Thank you, Janice. Generally speaking, it is true of us as people that we love babies, right? Certainly it seems at our house we love babies because we're collecting them. And anyway, but we love babies for a variety of reasons. We love them, among other things, because they're cute, right? And God knew what He was doing, right, when He made them cute. We talked about this before. Otherwise, we would certainly kill them. And so it makes them really cute. So we like babies from that standpoint. And so we see them, and even if you don't even know the baby, if you're out and about, and this happens for us, for example, Peter's our youngest. He won't be 2 until December. And people will make faces, and they'll say things that make no sense, right? Like, ooh, dad, dad. You just make strange noises, children, right? We do this because we think that they're cute and that we can get them a smile type of reaction from them. But we make these nonsensical noises, right? We coo, we jabber at them. Why do we do this? Well, because of this reality. Babies are, they're dumb, right? They just are. And for example, the other night I was getting ready to put Peter to bed, and so I'm changing his diaper, and he didn't want any part of this. He didn't want to go to bed, didn't want his diaper changed, didn't want me messing with him. And so I've got him laying on the changing pad there, and he's just kind of whining, not really loud, but I don't know, just kind of hollering, fussing a little bit. And so as he makes that wah, as he does that, I open my mouth in unison. I don't say anything, I just go. So he goes, wah, and I go. But when he stops, I stop. Well, this only happens a couple of times before all of a sudden Peter thinks this is kind of funny. So, wah. And so this goes on, and very quickly it seems as though Peter is operating under this premise. I am in control of Daddy's mouth. So I will make this noise, I will cause his mouth to open, right? That's what he's thinking. However, this is the case. There has not and was not a moment in any of that instance where I ceased to be in control. There wasn't a moment that I ceased to be in control. As you pay attention, or to the extent that you pay attention to what's going on in life and around us, my hope is you recognize this. There's an awful lot of bad stuff going on. It takes little observation to see there's an awful lot of bad stuff going on. Beyond that, it seems that there are a lot of bad people throughout the world, and here, even at home, that are doing bad things, inflicting harm and injury and inflicting bad things on other people, innocent people, and many times it seems that they do so without consequence. And you see all this bad stuff that goes on, and you say, you know what? From a spiritual perspective, I can see, it certainly seems like the devil's at work, right? All this bad stuff, it seems pretty clear that the devil is doing stuff, but what about God? Why are we not seeing more good stuff? Why is, if God's around, why is all this bad stuff happening? I can see the devil's at work, that he's around, but what about God? And it can lead people to this question. Well, who exactly is in charge? If I can see the devil's handiwork everywhere, and I don't seem to see the Lord's handiwork everywhere, who exactly is in charge? So let me answer that question very succinctly and clearly. There has not been a moment, there is not a moment, and there will not be a moment, not one sliver of a second, where God has relinquished control of His universe. There has not, is not, and there will not be an instance where God has lost control of anything. If then that's the case, why is it that we see what we see going on? Why is it that the devil seems to appear as though he's in charge? There's a couple of passages that help us think through these questions. We're going to look at them today. And the first is in Job chapter 1. Job chapter 1. And while you're looking for that, if you want to, once you get there, stick something in there and then flip over and find Luke 22. We're going to get there in just a moment. But there's two passages, one Old Testament, one New Testament. If you don't have a Bible, I hope you'll grab one in front of you, because there's nothing I say today that's any more important. In fact, nothing I say is even at least as important as what God says in His Word. I want you to see it. I don't want you just to hear it. So find a Bible, Luke 22 and Job chapter 1. We see so much bad, but yet I say God's in control. How is it that this can be? Based on what we're going to see in these passages, a couple of things are true, and the first is this. Satan can only do what God permits. Satan can only do what God permits. Look with me in Job chapter 1. Verse 6 says, "On the day the sons of God came to present themselves before the Lord, Satan also came with them." All right, so stop there for a second. Who exactly are the sons of God? Now, there is some debate as to who exactly this is referencing and who these individuals or these beings are. It is my conviction that this phrase, the sons of God, is a reference to the messengers, the beings of God that do His bidding. Those are angels. But you know also, we've talked about this before, not all of these angels turned out to be so good, did they? You remember when Satan rebelled, he was an angel. He took a third of the angelic host. They decided to sign up with him to abandon the one who made them and swear their allegiance to Satan. It seems, however, though, that these angels, these angelic beings, both good and bad, have not, and this is true, they have not ceased operating under the thumb of God's control. And what it seems that we see reference to is the fact that they're reporting to check back in. The angels, the messengers of God, are reporting on what they have been doing and gaining their new assignments. But it seems, in fact, that since the text tells us that Satan joins the line as well, that he has to get in line as well and report. And so the Lord begins the conversation not to express His ignorance as to what's occurring, but just in a way to begin the conversation, where have you come from? And Satan responds, from roaming throughout the earth. And the implication is that he has been roaming, looking, seeking individuals that he can target, looking for a victim. It says, and walking around on the earth. And it seems clear that he's been searching, but he's kind of coming up empty-handed. Can't find exactly who it is that he wants to target. And so the Lord says to him in verse 8, "Have you considered my servant Job?" Makes you want to think, I don't really want to put God on my reference list, correct? It's going to suggest to the devil, how about this one? But the Lord says to Satan, "Have you considered my servant Job?" And then he describes Job. He says to Satan, "There's no one else on earth like him, a man of perfect integrity who fears God and turns away from evil." So he's saying to Satan, listen, this is a guy that's on my team. This is a guy that follows me, and he does so, not because he's perfect, but he does so consistently, shot through with integrity. He's serious about following me and keeping in accordance and living in accordance with my ways. Have you thought about him? And so after hearing this, Satan responds in verse 9. And this is a rhetorical question. He says, does Job fear God? Does he fear you for nothing? And what Satan is doing is alleging something. He's suggesting, God, you've got this guy on your team, and he's a follower of yours because life is good. He's got lots of stuff. He's experienced legions of blessings, and that's why he's one of your followers. And so he says to God in verse 10, haven't you placed a hedge around him, his household, and everything he owns? You have blessed the work of his hands, and his possessions have increased in the land. But, verse 11, if you stretch out your hand and strike everything he owns, he will surely curse you to your face. So the fact that Job, or for that matter, anybody, the only reason they're on your team is because you give them stuff. You quit giving them stuff, and then they'll curse you. They'll abandon you. And so the Lord says, very well, Everything he owns is in your power. However, do not lay a hand on Job himself. And so so that Satan left the Lord's presence. And what happens in the rest of the book of Job, you're probably pretty familiar with. Things really, really, really get bad for Job. And so you read this, and you're like, well, there's going to be some questions that come to mind. For example, why is it that God would suggest Job? Why is it that he would permit Satan to attack Job? And we'll deal with those questions in a moment. But one of the things that is important to note is this. Satan is getting ready to attack Job like he has never been attacked before. He is getting ready to experience loss in ways that he has never experienced before. He is getting ready to experience emotional and physical pain like he has never felt before. It is getting ready to be off the charts bad. But notice this. How does he wind up experiencing that assault? Because God grants Satan permission. Not only does he grant him permission, but God articulates the boundaries of the assault. You can come after him, but only within these parameters. You can't touch him, which is to say, you can't take his life. You can take his stuff. Everything that's dear to him, his health, his family, everything. You can take all that, but can't take his life. It's important to note, and we'll come back to deal with the other question in just a moment as to why God would do this, but this stands to reason. You have to logically recognize this. If you have to gain permission before you do something, you're not in control. If you have to gain the authority from someone else before you can do something, your authority is subject to theirs. Satan, again, can only do that which God permits. All right, you see that not only in the Old Testament, but you see it in the New. Flip over to Luke 22. At this point, it is very late in the ministry of Jesus. In fact, this is his last night on earth, or before the crucifixion. He has just celebrated the final Passover meal with the disciples. And in verse 31, he's got the disciples there. It seems Judas is probably already going about to do his deed. But in verse 31, Jesus says this, Simon, Simon. Well, who's that? Well, we know him as Peter. But Jesus addresses him by the name that he had before his encounter, before he first experienced Jesus. Simon, Simon, look out. Satan has asked to sift you like wheat. But I have prayed for you that your faith may not fail, and when you have turned back, strengthen your brothers. And you're familiar with what happens. Peter says, that's not going to happen. Lord, I'm ready to go with you both to prison and to death. Verse 34, Jesus says, I tell you, Peter, the rooster will not crow today until you deny 3 times that you even know me. What is important to note is what you see at the end of verse 31. Satan has asked. Satan has requested. Satan has sought to gain permission. Now again, we're going to flesh this out more in just a moment, but bear this in mind. If you have to get permission, if you have to get approval for that which you do, you're not in control. Satan is getting ready to come after Peter. But before he can do this, he has had to ask. Again, why it is that God permits Satan to do any of this stuff is a question for just a moment. But the point remains that Satan cannot do anything and everything that he wishes. He can only do that which he conjures up, that he gains permission from God to actually do. And that which he gains permission to do is limited in scope by the one who ultimately has authority. Dualism is the philosophical thought that good and evil exist essentially as equals. There's good and there's bad, and they're constantly in tension. There's, it's kind of a 50-50 thing, and one's in charge today, the other one's in charge tomorrow. It's a constant back and forth flip-flop. Too easily, that mentality has crept over into our theological perspective of God and Satan, where we have kind of viewed Satan as kind of like a peer of, on level with, that it's like a 50-50 thing between he and God, and it's still yet to be determined who's going to be the winner. Again, bear in mind, there has not been, there will not be a time, it has never occurred and will never occur, an instance, a micron of a second where God has ceased to be in control. And Satan, everything that he does, every act that he has conspired against you, against this church, against anyone, nothing has he been able to do other than that for which he has gained permission. And he can only do what God permits. You've heard me mention before my grandmother on my mom's side, whose name, I called her Charles, but she lived with us after my grandfather's death for the next 20 years until she died. And I think, in junior high school when this happened. She had a friend of hers whose name was Jewel, and Jewel's husband died. And as I recall, it was on a Friday, and I don't know. In junior high, I didn't have anything else to do, and didn't have a good reason not to go. And so my mom is going to drive my grandmother, and she takes my sister and myself to go to Jewel's house to express our sympathies for her and just to visit with her after her husband's death. Anyway, so it's Friday night, it's dark, we get out of the car, we go to the door, we've rung the doorbell, and as we're waiting for Jewel to come to the door, at that point, Charles announces to us, "Oh, by the way, she's got a mean dog that'll bite the mess out of you." All right, so Jewel comes to the door, she invites us in, and she takes us into the living room, and the living room kind of opens up to the dining room, and then I can see this dog. His name is Frito. Frito is a Chihuahua. And Chihuahuas, some of you may have one. Chihuahuas can be a mixed bag. The meanest dogs I've ever seen have been Chihuahuas. Some of the sweetest dogs I've ever known have been Chihuahuas. You don't know what you're going to get, but Frito was ferocious. And Frito is in the dining room. He's got a collar on, and he's got a leash connected to the collar, but that collar is under the leg of the dining room table. And do you remember the Tasmanian Devil in the Looney Tunes cartoons? Anyway, that's kind of what Frito is doing. And he's in there snarling, and he keeps choking himself because he's trying to lunge to get to us. And there's a lot of stuff I didn't know at that age, but I knew this. If that dog gets a hold of me, he wants to gnaw me into pieces from here down, right? There was not a moment that I decided I'm going to go over into the dining room. I stayed away. And this dog, who would have bit me and gnawed on me unmercifully, didn't do anything to me except leave me with a memory. This dog, who could have really caused me some injury and some harm and some pain, the potential was there the entire time, except for this fact: he could only get me if I got in his circle. He was constrained. He could only do what he wanted within the parameters that had been afforded him. I hope you see where I'm going with this, but I want to limit the extension of the thought, because Satan is exponentially more dangerous than a Chihuahua. He is not an ankle biter. He has a fierce arsenal of weapons and resources at his disposal. He knows more than you do. He's stronger than you. He's got legions of demons that assist him in his efforts. But the parallel does carry forward in this thought, which is this: as dangerous as he is, and as much harm as he seeks to impose on you, there is nothing that he can do except in the area where he's permitted to be. Satan can only do what God permits. Here's a second thought you need to keep in mind, and that's this: Satan and God use the same act for different goals. Satan and God use the same act for different goals. In both passages, the Old Testament passage with Job, New Testament passage with Peter, you have two individuals under satanic assault. He's got his scope out, and his crosshairs have narrowed on individuals. First on Job, then on Peter. In both instances, not only are they experiencing a satanic assault, they are experiencing a satanic assault that God has knowingly authorized. This does not happen in the isolation of God's knowledge. This doesn't happen while God's not paying attention. Again, before Satan ever does anything to Job, he gets permission from God. Before Satan ever does anything to Peter, he gets permission from God. So the reasonable question is this: why in the world would God do that? I mean, why would he let him do anything? If he's up to no good, why would God permit him to actually do anything? And beyond that, from a logical perspective, is it correct that I am correct in this? Can it be that God knows what Satan's up to and grants him permission to do these things? I would argue both reasonably, on the basis of reason, and on the basis of theological absolutes, it must be this way. Consider this: if this were to occur, if Satan were to attack Job in the absence of God's knowledge, what does that suggest about God's knowledge? It suggests that it's limited. He does not know everything. He is not, in fact, as we have often described, he's not omniscient. So if Job is attacked by Satan in the absence of God's knowledge, again, that suggests, well, God doesn't know everything. But we are here in part this morning because we understand, and this Bible makes plain, there is nothing that has, is, or ever will escape the knowledge of God. God has to know this is occurring. But we've just argued a moment ago that Satan can only do that which God permits him to do. So how is it that, is it the case that God grants permission? Well, it has to be that way. Otherwise, this is not true. God's not actually in control. If there are individuals who are less than you, who do not have the authority that you have, who do not have the reign and control that you have, if they are doing stuff that you know about, that you don't approve, you have the ability to stop it, correct? If you actually are in charge. If you actually have the authority. Again, the argument is, and I believe it to be a certainty, Satan acts in the knowledge of and with the permission of God, so why not stop it? I believe the answer, and you may not love the answer, but it doesn't change what I believe to be reality. He wants to use what Satan is seeking to accomplish for very drastically different aims and goals. Back in the Job passage, why is it that Satan is now going to zero his and hone his weaponry on Job? Well, it's pretty clear. He wants to inflict injury. He wants to inflict pain and suffering and all sorts of awful circumstances on Job, not simply for the sake of making him miserable, but because he has a primary aim. And his primary aim is twofold. He wants to prove God wrong. Remember what his allegation was. He says, Job fears you for nothing. He has just wagged his finger in the face of God and said, the only reason this guy's wearing the God jersey, the only reason this guy's on your team is because you've given him good stuff. But you get rid of the signing bonuses, you get rid of the lucrative contract, and all of a sudden he's going to jump ship. In fact, beyond that, he's going to curse you. He's going to say, you're awful. He's going to say, you stink. He's going to say, I want nothing to do with you. And so he wants to prove God wrong. And secondly, he wants to get Job off God's team. He relishes the thought of him saying to the Lord essentially what Satan has said. You're not worthy of submitting to. I choose to thumb my nose in your face. I choose to reject you and spurn you. That's why Satan comes after Job. That's what he hopes to accomplish. That's why he's doing what he does in Job's life. Well, what about in the New Testament example? What about with Peter? In fact, Jesus actually tells us the answer. In his warning to Peter in verse 31 of Luke 22, he says that Satan is asked to sift you like wheat. If you're familiar at all with that whole process, that's a very turbulent, violent act on which to separate its various parts. He's wanting to put you through the ringer, is what Jesus is saying to Peter. He's asked to come at you ferociously. He wants to get you. And Jesus says, but I prayed for you that your faith may not fail. So that suggests the motive. The motive is to get Peter's faith to fail. To get him, this guy that has been following Jesus sacrificially for the past 3 years. This guy who's left everything, who's been sacrificing at exorbitant length to follow Jesus, to get him to say, all that was a waste of time. I'm going to turn my back on Jesus. I'm done with all this Christian stuff. And then he says, and he's praying, Jesus says he's praying for Peter that when you have turned back. Well, that's suggesting that Jesus knows what's going to happen, that Peter is going to turn away. Well, that reveals and pulls the curtain back on the motive of Peter. The motive behind his attack on Peter. He wants to get him to turn away. He wants his faith in Jesus to fail. All right, so two individuals, both under satanic assault. Job and Peter. The specifics are different, but in the end, the goal's kind of the same, isn't it? To get people, to get these two guys to say, God, I don't want anything to do with you. I'm tired of this following you stuff. It's not panning out how I thought. It's not paying off like I thought it would. You're not as good. You're not as great. You're not worthy of me submitting to. You're not worthy of me following. I'm done with this. I'm leaving you in the rearview mirror. That's the aim in both instances. That was Satan's goal. But that's a very different thing than what the Lord was up to. What was God's aim in permitting Satan such a horrific assault on Job? You may not like the answer, but as you read the remainder of his story, it becomes clear, especially as you get to around chapter 38. That God had the goal of leading Job to discover and come to understand things about God that he would have never come to know and understand and discover in the absence of adversity. And in fact, you've got chapter 38, chapter 39, chapter 40, chapter 41, all the way up to 42. All of these chapters where God goes on at length describing the things that are true of him. I mean, has God ever given you 4 biblical chapters? I mean, at length, all of these things about himself. I mean, he's pulling the curtain back, saying, this is who I am, this is how I operate. And I'm telling you, Job wouldn't have known any of those things were it not for his experience of colossal adversity. And what you see occur is in chapter 42, so at the very end of the story. It's in verse 2 of chapter 42. Job says this to the Lord, I know that you can do anything and no plan of yours can be thwarted. The Job of chapter 1 didn't know that. The Job of chapter 2 didn't know that. The Job of chapter 10 didn't know that. The Job of chapter 42 does. Why? Because he endured and experienced this satanic assault. The same act that Satan sought to use to destroy Job, the same act that Satan sought to use to get Job to turn his back on God, what did God want to use it for? To draw him closer, to show him things about himself that he would have never, ever, ever discovered otherwise. With Peter, Satan aimed to get him to turn from and to turn on Jesus. And for a night, it happened, didn't it? As chapter 22 begins, or continues, right after this, you have the Garden of Gethsemane. Jesus is arrested. And then in that night, first, a young servant girl, maybe 12 years old, says, as she looks at Peter, weren't you with him? Aren't you one of those guys with Jesus? And Peter's like, no, you got me confused. And then, a short time later, in the same night, a random guy, unnamed, seems to be void of influence and position, says, weren't you one of those people with Jesus? Oh, no, not me. Not me. That must be some other strikingly handsome person you have. No, that wasn't me, though. Not me. Now they say everybody's got a double. Maybe that was mine you saw. And then another, nameless, seemingly positionless man says to Peter, weren't you with Jesus? Aren't you one of those guys that was hanging out with him? No. In fact, in this night, Peter even curses these people by saying, you've lost your blessed mind if you think I am with him. And do you remember just a few hours earlier, Peter has told Jesus in verse 33, Lord, I'm ready to go with you both to prison and to death. Until, they actually come and arrest you and attempt to kill you. And then, no, I'm going to abandon ship. So just hours before, he said, Jesus, I am with you to the very end. If they arrest you, they're taking me. If they kill you, they're killing me. Aren't you with Jesus? Nuh-uh. Not me. Fat chance. I have nothing to do. I don't even know who he is. I've never met him before in my life. All that happened because of Satan gaining the permission to assault him. And it looks like it's working. Satan's aim was to get Peter to turn his back on Jesus, and for a period of hours, it looks like it has happened. Jesus predicted it was going to happen, and Peter says, no, Jesus, you got that wrong. And Jesus tells him, no, before the rooster crows, before sunup, 3 times you're going to do it. And after the 3rd time, all of a sudden, off in the distance, there's a cock-a-doodle-doo. Peter realizes Jesus was exactly right. And his grief over what he has done, his conviction over what he has done, changes him. Changes him. Why did the Lord permit this? Jesus knew this was going to happen. Why did it occur? Jesus discloses it in verse 32. He says, when you turn back, you can strengthen your brothers. Jesus knew that these denials would be so painful that it would not only lead Peter back to Jesus, it would lead Peter to be used by Jesus to draw the others even closer to him. Not only that, but it had such a profound effect on Peter that this happened. On that night, a young girl, let's say she's 12 years old, comes up to Peter, and she's not saying anything other than, hey, weren't you with Jesus? She's not saying, you tell me if you're on his team because I want you in jail. I want your neck. She doesn't say that. She just says simply, aren't you with Jesus? And Peter's like, no, fat chance. Not a chance in the world that I'm with that dude. You must have me absolutely confused with somebody else. So on the night of Jesus' betrayal and arrest, Peter denies, even to a 12-year-old girl, honestly, what's she going to do to him? He's a grown man. He's rough and tough. What exactly is it that she's going to do to him? But he, to her face, says an absolute lie and denies knowing anything, having anything to do with Jesus. Why in the world would Jesus permit that type of assault? Not only to lead the rest of the disciples closer to him, not only to lead Peter closer to Jesus, but fast forward about 30 years, to around 64 to 67 A.D., and it's not a 12-year-old girl. It's the Roman leadership under Nero who says, if you're associated with Jesus, you lose your life. And not only does Peter on that day not deny Jesus, on that day, not only does he say that I know him and I'm with him, I will not turn from him even if it costs me my life. And even when they demand his execution, he says, you know what, I'm so committed to him. I am not even worthy to be killed in the same manner. And he demands to be crucified upside down. Same act, two completely different goals. Why in the world would the Lord permit Satan to do this? Because he had something wonderful in store. And as Joseph says, as his story concludes in Genesis, in effect, this is a slap in the face of the devil. What you meant for evil, I meant for good. He does it in Job's life. He does it in Peter's life. And what he did in theirs, he will absolutely do in yours. There's, with 5 kids in our house, a lot of busyness, a lot of movement, a lot of chatter, and unfortunately a lot of arguing, right? At any given point, there's at least 2 of them that are bickering or at odds with the other. Generally over something of no consequence, and it kind of shifts from who's fussing at each other. But regularly we hear things like this, in the car, in the van, in the house, outside. Well, you be quiet. No, why don't you shut your mouth? Why don't you shut your mouth? And you know the only thing that happens? Nobody shuts their mouth. I'm just wishing that one of them will finally listen to the other. But you know what? It never works. One says, why don't you shut your mouth? The other one emphatically doesn't shut his mouth. Why is that? Because they know this. My brother or my sister, none of them is in charge of me, and so I don't have to listen to them. The one who is not in charge of me, I don't have to listen to. If you're here this morning as someone who says, I'm a follower of Christ, you've got an enemy who has you in his sights. He's got, honestly, a ton more power and legions more resources than what you have. I'm telling you. I'm also telling you this. You don't have to listen to him because you're not under his control. In fact, he is not even in control of himself. Though he is the devil, as Martin Luther said it best, he remains God's devil. The best way I thought to tie all this together is not in a series of words that I came up with, but in a series of words that were put together by a hymn writer named Maltby Babcock. And this is a series of words you may be familiar with. This is my Father's world. Oh, let me never forget that though the wrong seems oft so strong, God is the ruler yet. Will you bow your heads with me? Maybe this morning you needed to hear, in the chaos of your life and in the misery of present circumstances, God has not relinquished control. And though Satan is absolutely powerful and he can do that which you cannot, and though he has resources that are far more powerful than you, he is not in control. Maybe you need to be reminded of that. Maybe it is that you are under assault by him. And I don't know what that assault is. And it can take legions of different forms. And maybe you don't like the fact that if that is occurring, it happens with the express approval of God. Maybe you don't like that. But I hope you like this. God's trying to do something altogether good. Altogether good. And what Satan means for evil, God means for good, and that Paul was correct when he says that God uses all things. That even means the stuff that Satan does. And he works that together for good. Maybe you need to pray to the Lord this morning and say, God, I've been going through some stuff that is bad. And I don't know from whence it came, but I want to see you do something good in my circumstances. Will you help me discover the things to be true that you want me to discover? Will you help me to see your hand at work, because I know that it is? Maybe you're here this morning and we've talked a lot today about these things being true of those who wear the jersey as a follower of Jesus, and you would say, I don't quite know if that's me. I don't know if I am on God's team. I don't know if I'm a part of His family. I want to figure this thing out. Well, in just a moment, you're going to have an opportunity to respond, and I would ask you to do something. Just leave where you are and come share that with me. And you may be a little nervous about that, but I'm telling you, there's no reason to feel any shame at all. But if you're scared to death of doing that, please see me afterwards. Let's have a conversation so that you can get this settled. I'm telling you, it'll make not only a difference in your life, it'll make a difference in your eternity. Maybe this is the place where you know that God's leading you to invest your life and family, and today's the day to unite with His church family. Maybe you just need to talk to God and say, Lord, you've etched it firmly in my heart. This is your world, and I need to start acting like someone who is under your control. I just need to talk to you. As He guides, we respond. Thank you, Lord, for being who you are, and as God, you're in control of everything. Not simply this world, not simply those who admit to being on your side, but even those beings that you have made that rebelled against you. And so, God, as you have voiced truth to our heart, as you are showing us specific levels of application, I pray, God, that we follow your lead and the decisions you call us to make right now, that we make them. We commit this time to you in Jesus' name. Amen.